There we go. Hello, everyone. I'm Ashley with NAGT. Welcome to the final webinar of the 2023-2024 webinar season. The NAGT webinar series is a one-stop shop for increasing our community's capacity in Earth education. Our webinars feature novel and innovative work such as Earth education research and pedagogy, new teaching materials, and the classroom and professional experiences of people just like you. The NRGT webinar series is free and open to the public. We often get questions of, is it okay if I tell my colleagues about this? Yes, please invite your colleagues. The more the merrier. It's always exciting when we get a nice big group of people attending the webinars. Also, throughout the webinar, feel free to use the chat box as a place for discussion, questions, and comments. We'll take questions at the end of the webinar though, so you'll also have an opportunity then to ask your questions. Additionally, you can use the little reactions tab to give off cute little emoji reactions. I think they're super cute. Your mileage may vary. Otherwise, in terms of interacting with each other, please remember that we follow the NAGT Code of Conduct. I'll drop a link to that in the chat once I'm finished. And today in our webinar, we have scientists and educators who will share an overview of the work they published in the recent In Our Voices JGE publication. And now go ahead and hand it over to Dana from the NAGT DEI Committee to get us started.
Thank you, Ashley. Thanks everyone for being here. It's a great crowd. My name is Dana Thomas. I use she, her pronouns. I'm coming to y'all from Austin, Texas, where until fairly recently, I was at the University of Texas at Austin doing some educational programming towards broadening participation and also instruction in energy and earth resources education. And today, what I'm excited about is to be here with you to share with you first a little bit about what NAGT does in terms of DEI activities. And I'm a member of the NAGT DEI committee. So let me get a couple of slides up just to share with y'all some of the things we do. Okay, apologies. I have to allow it. There we go. Okay. Anyone who is a member of NAGT can be involved in NAGT DEI committee. And that is who is bringing today's webinar to you. So we are focusing today on a publication or the results of one of the issues of the Journal of Geoscience Education, or JGE, which is the member research journal of NAGT. As a member of NAGT, you have access to the Journal of Geoscience Education. This issue was also open access. We chose, or the JGE editor chose to make this issue an open access issue. So anyone who is on this webinar, you can go to the JGE site and browse the articles. And I would also encourage you, if you're not an NAGT member, to please become one, and you'll have access to this JGE all the time. So DEI at NAGT, couple of things I wanted to highlight. The NAGT DEI committee is we support and also take on initiatives in NAGT that benefit DEI, including currently we're working with the executive director and with other leaders to review our awards process and try to make that more transparent, have published rubrics, et cetera, et cetera. We also organize the Excellence in JEDI Award. The photos of our 3 awardees to date are shown here: Dr. Anita Marshall, Dr. Vashon Wright, and Dr. Raquel Bryant. And we also collaborate across NAGT. NAGT kind of also, in addition to the committee, we have a number of resources. We have this, what I think is a really great page that compiles both organizations, affinity groups, all sorts of other ethics policies and codes of conduct. There are many projects that have been done or sponsored by NAGT that have useful tips, and including advanced geo is on there too. So I encourage you to look at that. And one more plug before we get into the meat of the webinar. The Earth Educators Rendezvous is a joint meeting between NAGT and the Science Education Resource Center. This summer, it's from July 15th to 19th in Philadelphia, and you can become an NAGT member and get $100 off your registration. I think it's a really unique meeting that combines workshops, panels, roundtables. It's a lot more interactive than your typical conference. And some of the program events that I decided to pull out that might be of interest to this audience include an afternoon workshop on Monday. So each afternoon or Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, there are many workshops. This one, as you can see, is on LGBTQ plus representation in the geosciences, showing our students that they belong. And then 3 more that I pulled. This top one is a plenary talk by our 2023 Excellence in JEDI Award winner, Dr. Anita Marshall. And then a couple other roundtables down here that'll be on Tuesday, attracting and supporting diverse geoscientists, a discussion on neurodiverse spaces in geoscience. And there are many more under this theme. So I encourage you to take a look and consider registering and joining us in Philadelphia. All right, and with that, I am going to hand it over to 5 of the authors of publications in the In Our Voices issue of Journal of Geoscience Education. They're each going to give an overview of their article, and then after each panelist has been able to go, we'll use our remaining time for Q&A. And I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves when they're up. Thank you. Here are our 5 panelists that you'll get to hear from today, and it's not quite in this order, but I think almost.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Downen, and I use he and they pronouns, and I'm at Center College in Danville, Kentucky. I work in the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I also teach geology in the Environmental Studies program here. So about my article, a couple of years ago, Allison Olcott, one of my colleagues, and I worked on a project that investigated the experiences of queer and trans people in geology, both like in the field in geology and in the classroom. And what I would like to start off with is just kind of like some of the like pushback or arguments that kind of pop up whenever we talk about like gender or sexuality with regard to geology. So one of the main questions is, why do I need to worry about diversity and inclusion, especially with, something like sexuality that may be not as visible, gender also not visible all the times. Because geology is about rocks, that's what we're talking about. But the point is that like it's people who study these rocks, and there are a lot of LGBTQ plus geoscientists in all subdisciplines within geology, and we're also teaching rocks to people, and that includes people with different identities who are going to be facing different challenges or barriers and things like that in higher education. And so, is this really an issue? Is like another thing that gets brought up. And it is. So the success of like queer and trans students in the classroom is coupled to their interactions with faculty, and also to visibility of people that sort of share or have their same identity. And we know that's not the case for geology, that it's low, that visibility, representation, and student support in the classroom is pretty low. And I just like want to highlight an interesting intersection of like queer history and geology with Clyde Warhoftig. He sort of like famously came out as gay during his 1989 Distinguished Career Award acceptance speech at the GSA annual meeting. And like, honestly, just from that moment of like visibility sparked like sort of like a major like movement within GSA in terms of like there, began an LGBTQ plus social, which has just like grown exponentially, and includes tons of younger people who are like actively students, in our field. Next slide, please. So as far as supporting LGBTQ plus students in the classroom, there's kind of like three of the like big easy ways that most people know about. And one of those is pronouns. So using like the correct pronouns that a student wants you to use for them, and also sharing your own pronouns in your email signature or your syllabus, just as a way to sort of signal allyship, because students will pick up on that, even though it's a small thing. Confronting transphobia and queerphobia. So that includes just like, addressing those things immediately, like as they happen in your classroom, but also, probably including some kind of policy or language in your syllabus or like course website that addresses gender and sexuality. Oftentimes, you may be able to pull something from your institution or from like your, specific program or department could have language that you could adapt in there. And then the third thing that's like kind of the big easy is educating yourself. I'll show some resources on the next slide, but just, and with like LGBTQ plus like populations, there are way more diverse or way more identities than just those like few letters that are in this community. And it's not just about like learning like what all these different letters mean. It's also learning about like their experiences and like the intersectionality that's associated with different identities. So it's more, there's a lot to learn in that aspect. And then sort of like a slightly more elevated, strategy related to pedagogy or like your teaching practices is to use surveys in your class. You could start off the semester with a survey that asks students, what pronouns do you want me to use? And just asking like things about them. What do they know? What do they like? What clubs are they in? Just things to kind of set like an inclusive atmosphere in general, which does benefit like everybody. And then also introducing LGBTQ plus resources as part of the standard orientation. So this could be applied to like maybe field trips or field courses where, things related to like LGBTQ issues or barriers are just addressed and sort of like presented to everybody. And this is probably going to have to, be related to like housing or bathrooms and things like that. And then the last thing that I'll mention is incorporating LGBTQ plus themes into course content. And that might seem a little weird, especially in like STEM fields, because again, we have the mindset of like, well, we're talking about geology or chemistry or whatever. But we also show who is doing these things. There is data that has shown, historically, like in geoscience textbooks, it's primarily like white dudes who are like visible in, in textbooks. That's who is seen doing geology. But there are tons of queer and trans and other diverse identities in geology out there. So in your classrooms, if you're pulling material, research, content, whatever, just show who's doing it. And it can be as simple as like including a little picture or a link to their website or something like that, just so that it's there and somebody could, explore that on their own or see, who they are and potentially see someone who may have their, a similar identity. Next slide, please. So the last thing is just kind of like doing your research. On the right side, there's a couple of articles that have come out, but honestly, if you Google LGBTQ geology, there will probably be a whole bunch of like articles, blogs, web pages, and things like that that come up that highlight or just show like authentic voices in geology from queer and transgender people. And that is a good place to start when you're just like learning, like to learn what it's like, being in geology, but through that lens. There's also other resources online that are free. So like the Safe Zone Project and GLSEN, those have lots of resources for if you're wanting to educate yourself. I actually took material from both of those programs and like created my own sort of like training program, for my school. So there's tons of resources out there. And also just find other, queer and trans voices. So 500 Queer Scientists will have tons of, representation for different, different identities. And there's lots of LGBTQ plus geoscientists on Twitter as well. So it's just kind of like finding the people out there who are like talking about it and being visible. So that's all that I have.
Thank you so much, Matt. All right, we're going to keep us moving along, and I believe this is now Dr. Morales.
Yes. Hello. I'm Anareli Morales. I'm trained as an atmospheric scientist, but recently transitioned to the public sector, and I'm an air quality policy analyst for Weld County in northern Colorado. I'm basically a resource to everyone in the county on air quality topics. But before I got here, I did publish this paper in the in our Voices journal, and the main point, I guess, that I was trying to make with this study was that the effective science communication, and really any communication with a multilingual population, requires more than language translation. It requires being mindful of cultural communication styles. But that can be cultural anything really. But for this one, I particularly looked at communication styles. So for example, or we focused on the visual medium of educating people. So I was working at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and there we produce a lot of videos where we explain things to the public. And a lot of the, I guess, the translation or the availability of the products or these education materials is just translating it. So on the right, you see this translation of all the different ways to say hello. But then there's the style and the way that you communicate. So perhaps in some cultures, a bow is more appropriate, or you hug and kiss. And like, how many kisses is it? Which cheeks? Like, it's super, it depends on the culture. And all this helps us to engage our students or whoever we're trying to get to. And so for my paper specifically was looking at adults, Hispanic and Latinx adults, and how they would learn, engage, and forget the other one, but how would they engage with this complex science that I was trying to present via videos. And so I created one video that was a more traditional way of presenting information in science, which is very like a documentary. There's a narrator, there's an expert, and they're labeled as an expert, and there's images and animations. And then the test was a more informal conversational video where it's two friends hanging out, just having a picnic, and one of them happens to be a scientist, and you just kind of naturally start talking about science. So that's what we did. And can you click next slide? Yeah, so we did that, and we did find a lot of things, but I wanted to focus it more, I guess the rest of my little intro was on how I've connected what I learned during my postdoc to what I'm doing now and working in a public health department. Because it's all still, we're trying to do health literacy, which is basically science literacy. So what I've gathered from my work and from what I'm doing now is that cultural competency and humility are needed to provide effective, equitable, understandable, and respectful education to our students, and in my world, to our care, to our patients, to our clients. And so keeping in mind all this, so I guess cultural competency is like understanding of these cultures and the way they communicate, the way they show honor and respect, the dress, the hair, and like how all this plays a role in their values, and then humility. It's a different, I guess, theory of realizing that you are not perfect and you will never be perfect and you will make mistakes. And so in your journey of being culturally competent, you might mess up, and that's okay. And so having this humility that you're actively trying to learn. If you make a mistake, you're actively like reflecting on that mistake and doing better. So these are the two kind of things that I continue to think about. So this cultural competency, it provides a supportive learning environment. So from our paper, we found that having this this more informal kind of presentation of science was helpful for people that had past negative experiences in learning science at an early age. So there was like one person that said, "Oh, I like this one better because the other one reminded me of my school." So something had happened to them in the past that they associate these documentary kind of formal education medium as negative or just not for them. And so, yeah, keeping that in mind, providing a supportive learning environment for everyone. Competency in culture also helps us assess the perceived cultural distance to science. So how does an audience relate to the science? How does it, or how do they recognize how it plays a role in their day-to-day lives? And so I think the informal kind of mode or video pulled some of those out and trying to connect the weather to your day-to-day, which is a little bit easier to do, but other concepts might not be. And so understanding like the audience you're trying to reach, what is their culture, what is their cultural perception of distance to science? Like science is something someone else does, that's not for me. Or science is something someone else gets involved and participates, that's not for me. But trying to, I guess, empathize and get into their world of, no, this is for you, and let me understand your world, or I will try to understand your world so I can show you, or we can work together to find where science fits in your world. And then that informal video also provided awareness of viable careers for their communities. So being able to see someone that looks like them. So again, this perceived cultural distance where this is for someone else. So who are scientists? That's someone else, it's not me. But in our videos, we showcase Latinas, and a lot of the people were really happy to see that and felt seen. Next slide. And then another part of cultural competence and humility, it helps you evaluate the impact of your approach and continued learning. So, for example, our hypothesis was that this conversational communication style would be preferred by Hispanic Latinx adults because that's what, I don't know, that's what I thought. But in an educational setting, maybe it's not, because a formal communication style is associated with an authoritative voice in STEM, which is associated with more credibility and trust in the information. So there's all these additional layers to peel back. Obviously, cultures are not, you can't just understand them like with one thing, but just testing an approach, evaluating it, and seeing, oh, actually, that doesn't work in this sense, but it could work in this sense. And then you continue learning. So I included a bunch of cultural competency resources and information on deaf culture, because that's its own culture that is very, very rich and diverse. And so understanding that as well, if you're trying to engage those people or that community, and then some more specific cultural competence to education. And then I think in the cultural orientation resource exchange link, they have something called backgrounders, which is basically a document that gives you background information on certain people. So here in Weld County, we have a lot of refugees from Rohingya refugees, And so it was super helpful to have this background, or to understand their history and where they're coming from, and empathize with like the genocide they're running away from. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Morales. That was great to get such a broad context there at the end too. Thank you. Right, Dr. Julia Cisneros.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, my name is Julia Cisneros. I use she, her pronouns. I'm really happy to be here to present an overview of our paper, Grappling with Barriers in Geosciences from the Lens of Two Latina Geoscientists. Since I'm presenting a reflection of our experiences, I thought it would be nice to show you who we are, who the authors are. This is a picture of myself and my co-author, Aida Gulenkosi. We're both Latinas who pursued careers in geosciences. And as we entered our graduate education, we began to fill the lack of diversity with each step that we took up that academic ladder. And so through discussion together, we talked a lot, we found a lot of commonalities, and we realized that we both went to geoscience camps as young students, which sparked our interest in our journey towards pursuing a geoscience career. And so we knew that this was a route that we could take to do what others did for us and to continue to broaden participation in geosciences. And so that's what we did. We ran a successful geoscience camp where we brought 30 local minoritized students to our university to learn about geoscience topics. And then as we wrote that paper, we were like, oh, we have to share this with everybody. So we wrote a paper detailing the process, focusing really at the beginning on what is needed for long-term implementation and sustainable implementation. So focusing really on what that kind of relationship would look like and what that structure would look like. And we wrote a paper and we were like, okay, we feel like we shared that perspective. But through further reflection, we felt that we still needed to understand the reasons and why the reasons we found that limited the camp's continuation, such as things like forging community connections and uneven interest, revealed themselves in the building of our camp. So next slide. So we turned to previous works, and we really were inspired by the work of Jabari Jones in 2021, and we decided to advance that concept in the geosciences regarding divestment within diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so in this paper, we show how this disinvestment reveals itself by sharing the journey that we took to create the camp and the barriers that we experienced as we built the camp. We typologized these barriers into 3 categories, those being roadblocks, detours, and alternative routes. And so roadblocks here are unpassable institutional barriers, representing moments in our journey where the route we were taking was no longer possible. Detours are passable institutional barriers defined as moments along the journey that took considerable time and effort. And then alternative routes are the pathways that we took when we could no longer follow the route we were expecting to pursue. And so we had to create what we called an alternative route. And so we shared our journey creating the camp through the depiction, as you can see in figure 2, of a winding road, which shows the relationship and the interactions of those barriers that we typologized. The nature of the winding road, and specifically the extra distance that you can see in the winding road compared to the direct route between the start and finish flags, represents the extra time and effort cost that those barriers created for us, which we argue resulted in harm towards us and our careers. I think there's a click here. And so we argue in this paper that since there's no incentive or metrics to evaluate and value service and outreach in geosciences, white majoritized scholars who do not face the same disincentives have no reason to pursue these efforts because their personal disinterest is incentivized when they use the extra time and effort to pursue actions that are valued towards their career progression. So next slide, please. So we understand that this disinterest and disinvestment is not necessarily born out of harsh negativity or hatred, but it is instead a product of the white academic system. Balancing interest and outreach opportunities and the lack of value for service in academia is not only difficult, but it's harmful to one's career under the current academic system. So we wrote this paper as postdocs, reflecting on our experiences as graduate students when we built and ran this camp. And we knew that we needed to share our experience because we benefited greatly from reading the experiences from other minoritized geoscientists. I think there's a click. And so we detailed the barriers that we experienced when creating this camp because we felt that this was a really great example that we could encapsulate. But we argue that these barriers and others that we've experienced through grad school are no different than the ones that our peer minoritized scholars have experienced. And so the time lost navigating the barriers that we experience, and especially in this camp, represents time that we could have spent advancing our careers by gaining and improving academic skills, conducting research, analyzing data, and writing and publishing papers, all of which are vital to our success as PhD candidates at the time. And so the harms that we took when we ran into barriers in creating this camp often took hits at our perceived ability and self-esteem, but it also resulted in large amounts of time lost to recuperate, rebuild, and even re-envision. And so we believe that these harms result in the reasons that minoritized members leave academia, which leads to the lack of diversity that we're all trying to solve in the geosciences. We overcame these barriers. As you can see, both Aida and I are assistant professors in geoscience now, which is an accomplishment that we do not take lightly, especially given our personal identities as Latinas and geoscientists. Writing this paper and sharing our journey was an overwhelming yet healing experience for us, and then I click. We think that our ability as minoritized geoscientists to build resilience as we overcame each barrier is not something to be proud of. Instead, we hope that the presentation of our experiences and the resultant harms via time and effort lost will offer motivation to consider how to improve the ways we navigate seeking anti-racist justice in academia. We must ask whether our current expectations and systems can be modified to minimize harms in academia. So with that, I just want to say thank you all for your attention. I encourage you to check out the paper. I'm happy to talk more about it, but I'll go ahead and let the next person speak.
Thank you, Dr. Cisneros. Now we have Dr. Candace Duncan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I believe Dr. Cisneros summed up our paper, so I'm just going to say ditto to everything that she just presented. And hopefully our paper will kind of expound a little bit more on some of the topics that she touched on. So again, my name is Candace Duncan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. And the title of our paper that was in the journal is Our Collective Voices, Accounts and Recommendations for Recruitment of Underrepresented Groups in Geoscience STEM Disciplines from 3 faculty women of color. And I will specify we identify as African-American women. And so I present this work on behalf of my co-authors, Dr. Ebony Terrell-Shockley, who is our education expert. She's an executive director in the Office of the Dean in the College of Education. And my other colleague, Dr. Akuya Asawuku, is a professor and associate dean for diversity and equity in chemical and biomolecular engineering. So she represents our engineer, and I myself, an environmental analytical chemist, represent the science in our trio. Next slide, please. So this image may be familiar, quite familiar, but actually it is not what drove our motivation to write the paper. We had been funded through National Science Foundation to put on a program that actually tried to encourage students who are considered non-traditional geoscientists, and we define that as those who may be biology majors, chemistry majors, physics majors, who do work in the geoscience space. who may want to be considered geoscientists, and how do we get those individuals to see that the work that they're doing does fall under that category. And so we said, as we sit in that space ourselves, in our disciplines, how might we encourage minoritized students who look like us and others from diverse backgrounds to say, geoscience and STEM is where I want to be, and it's where I want to be long term. And so we had firsthand experience, just as Dr. Cisneros mentioned, their lived experience shaped how they decided to push through. And so we used part of that in our paper to describe our experiences. And then we said, as scientists and engineers, we got to have some data here. So we used the University of Maryland as a case study of geoscience and higher education, and chose our system because it was quite diverse in the sense that we do have community colleges, and we have HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities here in the state of Maryland, and maybe one or two considered Hispanic serving institutions. And so we thought with that group, we could look at it a little bit critically and say, where are the deficits in moving more minoritized groups into these fields and just up through to academia, because that's where we want to be. And I think another piece of our motivation was saying, you know, as the educational knowledge changes over with boomers leaving academia, how do we replenish that group? And how do we make sure that all voices are heard, all perspectives are seen, all experiences are kind of represented as we continue to do this science and then tack on all this tech and AI with it, right? And so we have this case study that we did, and we wanted to say, what are some ways that we're not able to see those minoritized groups move through those ranks into academia positions. Next slide, please. So our commentary questions were actually pretty straightforward. You know, how can faculty recruit underrepresented and underserved minorities in geosciences as current faculty? So I'm tenure track, and Dr. Shockley and Dr. Kuyasawuku are tenured faculty. So how can we recruit more minorities into the geosciences? And what are the barriers for that recruitment? Most of which we kind of already understood, having gone through the system ourselves. And then what are the lived experiences of STEM research and education faculty in higher ed as we are in our respective units? So those were our kind of overarching questions as we looked at how we might include this Maryland case study and look at it kind of critically. Next slide, please. So what I did here was kind of cherry pick from the paper one area of focus, right? So as academics, we're very familiar with funding. You have to get funding to move through those wickets in academia to reach tenure, right? And so a lot of the conversation was who is being funded? And the research kind of says, well, according to this NSF Foundation report during the 2009 and 2019 reporting period, they said there's a consistent funding rate. Between 20,400 and of the 6,389, the funding rate is 31%, but they were to white males. And then you have 47 submissions, 14 funded, giving also close a 30% funding rate for Native and Hawaiian. And it's so the comparison is saying, well, the funding rates are about the same. But let's just look at the sheer numbers. We're talking about faculty in higher education. They're just physically less in this minoritized group. And so we said, well, what can we do about that? And that goes back to our questions. How do we get more minoritized groups into academia so that their numbers look like that of the white males that are receiving all the funding, or quite a bit of the funding? So one way we came up with was that institutions need to address the implications of fewer minority faculty in their tenure and tenure track positions. And just recognize that they're not there, they're not represented. And then another piece is aiding minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, and tribal colleges with funding proposals. I don't know how many conversations I've had with faculty at HBCUs that say our infrastructure doesn't quite give us the same support to put in $1 million grant. And so if some of the larger institutions are kind of waving their hand at them, then that will continue to kind of perpetuate this problem where they're not able to get funding as it's just not quite as accessible. And so units kind of have to say to themselves, we need to partner. We have to be equitable in this process. And how can we do that? So that's just coming to the recognition that that's work you need to do. Right. And then encourage our underrepresented minorities in graduate programs to consider tenure track academic positions. This may be one of the hardest pulls, right? One of the hardest asks, because many times they matriculate through their undergraduate programs and don't see many students that look like them. And then they're being educated by many faculty that don't look like them. So honestly speaking, the motivation is not there to just keep going, right? And so that's something that our program was trying to encourage students to do. If they see individuals that look like us and they get to talk with us and sit with us and have conversations, maybe we can encourage them to say, if we did it, you can too. It'll be challenging, but we don't mind holding your hand through the process because maybe there was someone there to hold our hand a little bit through the process. So this funding slide here is just one of the pieces of information and takeaways that we published in the paper. Next slide, please. And so here are some quotes that our collective of voices between the three of us that was published that we can say was nervous or a little nerve-wracking to do, because you're kind of putting yourself out there saying, I'm saying this and I'm holding my feet to the fire with my statement. But it was, so these are some of the quotes that we kind of included in that: doing the invisible work, using numbers to quantify and justify application success. Many times we understand that GRE scores and grades aren't a true reflection of a student's capabilities. But sometimes being minoritized just puts you one more peg down sometimes in that big picture. And then choosing those who have academic currency already in the circle. That meaning some of the Ivy League schools, students who come from those schools kind of already they're good and have that trustworthiness already attached to them as they come into the systems. And then we talked about intimidating course descriptions from people from diverse backgrounds. I'm very much a Southerner, so I'm from the South, from North Carolina. And so how we see and recognize verbiage is very different. How we use our language is very different. And sometimes for some students, just the course description is challenging. And then feeling apprehensive towards those perceived notions. So you can kind of read through some of the comments that and feelings that we experience as we matriculated through our programs. So actionable practices, just advocate for diversity across the board. And then diverse representative faculty role models. If you see some, know some, tag them and let other students know that this individual could be there to help you matriculate through your program. And then respect for education and expertise of underrepresented minority faculty. That's a whole conversation in and of itself, right? And then acknowledging the education and expertise from HBCUs. That is actually on the rise now a little bit. Now that some of the larger institutions as well as private entities are recognizing the excellence, equal excellence that's coming out of some of these institutions. And then make resources and opportunities visible for all students. We've been through systems where we know some students were given an opportunity, whereas another wasn't shared that same opportunity. We should just make it, equitable across the board so everyone has a chance to be successful. Next slide. So with that, I just gave you a little snippet of what we published. You can scan the QR code to get access to the full article, and recognizing that this was funded by our NSF project. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan. All right, and our fifth and final presenter is Dr. Daryl Reno.
Hi, everyone. I'm Daryl. I'm from Acoma Pueblo, New Mexico, and I'm also an assistant professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University. I'm here to talk about this paper called Confluent Identities in the Geosciences. This was a really unique project that we all worked on, and I actually came late to the project. So kind of like the background, the QR codes on the right, I guess I should say, one is for the paper, and then the lower one is for a list of resources that I share with students. A lot of it's indigenous focused, but there's a lot of information that's helpful for everyone. But anyways, okay, so this project started as an undergraduate research project. Christina gets the second author you see listed there. She actually had this idea for, this was her idea for this project, and she wanted to do that. And Angel Garcia Jr., who some of you might know from various efforts across the geosciences, he also runs REU, I think. So he was her mentor, and they started out kind of developing this project, and they weren't initially planning on publishing it or everything, but then they decided to, pursue the IRB. And then they decided, well, why not try to work it into something? And they brought in one of the other faculty at James Madison University, where Angel and Christina are, or were at the time, and they brought in Liz Johnson. And she worked with them, and they got together this project and ran it. And so when you read the paper, the first half of the paper is really focused on this small scale research project that looked at how gender and sexual identity affect different people's identity as a geoscientist. And I know that there's a lot of different discipline-based education researchers thinking about science identity and how that might be different according to different STEM disciplines. And so this is kind of a step in that direction, this whole project was. And so they brought me on because they had the quantitative data sort of analyzed and things, but it didn't really have a lot of differences in it. And so they brought me on as a collaborator later in the later end of the project to work on the qualitative analysis. And so they had one open-ended question on the survey that they had sent out that asked, just, is there anything else that you would like to let us know? Very open-ended. And so we analyzed those results to kind of just see what things our survey might have missed. Next slide. So I just have a couple of slides of some of the results. And so this is one of the themes that we saw in these open-ended responses. And we labeled it an inequality and defined that as outcomes that are a result of inequitable treatment of sex, gender, and qualifications. And so these aren't, we're not trying to say that we're generalizing this data. This is qualitative data. So we're just taking an in-depth look at individual people's experiences. And when we ran the survey, the respondents, they weren't very representative of the entire geoscience community. They weren't very representative of the LGBTQ community. And so, our results, we try qualitatively, we wanted to just think about individuals' experiences. And so these themes aren't meant to say that these things are themes that would hold up across the entire geoscience community. We're just kind of taking an in-depth look at what some people are experiencing in the geoscience community. And so you can see some of the markers there about their whether or not they're a member of the LGBTQ community, what credentials they might have earned in terms of geoscience degrees, and then also a sort of numerical number range showing how many years they've been involved in the geosciences, and then a self-described race or ethnicity identities or any other identities they wanted to share. And so, what we were seeing in some of these themes was that even across these different age ranges, people that have been in the community for different amounts of time, because a lot of times you think like, well, are we getting better? Or, things are happening, but we see that people in both of in all of these different ranges are still experiencing things like inequality. And again, this doesn't mean these are necessarily problems every single place or that every single person in the community experiences this, but this is what we're seeing in some of the experiences that people self-report. Next slide. Another thing we saw was related to people's feelings of a sense of belonging, which is a feeling or lack thereof for support, care, inclusion, and welcoming into the geoscience community. And yeah, so you can take a second and read some of those, but it really, this opened up our eyes in terms of when we analyzed the data for the survey, the quantitative data, we saw that there wasn't really a significant difference between the respondents for most of the questions or any of the questions that we analyzed. And so a quantitative researcher might look at that and say, oh, well, I guess, there's not too much difference in experience by individuals. But when we look at the open-ended responses, we see that there are some things that they want to voice that weren't really captured on the survey, the quantitative aspects of the survey. And so, this points us in a direction for thinking more critically about how to ask different questions that might give us a more holistic view of people's everyday experiences in the geoscience community. And so, yeah, I think overall, the idea for the project is, wow, this was started as an undergraduate research project and turned into something that can be useful to a much more larger proportion of the geoscience community, and so that came from this really unique collaboration between all of us from diverse identities. And so, yeah, thank you for letting us have some time to share our work with you.
Thank you, Dr. Reno. I'm going to stop my share so that everyone can see each other. And that was fantastic. I really enjoyed getting to hear about all of y'all's work. A reminder to everyone that these presenters are all authors representing publications in a Journal of Geoscience of Education issue from 2023, highlighting diverse voices in the geosciences. We do have 6 minutes for some questions. I can attempt to moderate here. We have the chat function. You can also use the hand raising react, or Ashley, please feel free to step in and correct me if I'm doing something wrong. I can ask a general question that was inspired by this most recent presentation, Daryl's, and then Candace's. So most of these findings they're focused in geoscience, the culture of geoscience, right? And people's experiences in geoscience, which itself is a broad field. But does anyone, here, maybe Candace, because you kind of bridge some disciplines, have a sense of what these, maybe a finding like this, the findings in the survey that Daryl, you were interpreting or analyzing, how does that compare to findings from engineering disciplines or chemistry or physics, knowing that there might not be one answer to that question. But any of our panelists have thoughts?
Well, what I can say is we did not, well, actually your question is a good another paper. Kind of bridging that between geosciences and comparing it with other disciplines. But I'm sure you all already know that geoscience is like the minority of the minority in STEM, right? Especially with minoritized groups. And engineering is under there. And our paper does have some comparisons with minoritized groups in other disciplines. As we were looking at students in geoscience, but holistically, a lot more could be done, right? It didn't necessarily give us anything that we didn't kind of already know just by being in the fields. When you're talking about visibility and who you actually see when you go out and do field work and consultants and all that kind of work. But actually your questions are really good paper to see if other STEM fields are experiencing that as well as it comes to just being visible and trying to do good science in your field. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for reminding us of how our numbers are, you know, we're the least diverse of all of the STEM fields. Yeah. And we
I have
these unique-
I
yeah.
have a question or comment or something. I'm not sure. And one of the things that happens is that if a department wants to grow and they want diverse voices heard, and you happen to be the one person in the department, they keep tapping you, be on the search committee, be on this committee, be on that committee. And I was just wondering kind of how you navigate that space and also how and when you can say no.
Well, I don't think the question was just directed to me because this is Cisneros, I'm sure is in the same position. But when I started my tenure track position, my chair was really good about allowing me to use him as my scapegoat. And so he did give me some space to say, okay, if you want me to do this, you need to ask my chair kind of thing. So I didn't feel all the weight of saying no all the time. But I didn't have a problem saying no. Because I knew I needed to protect my time and prioritize how I was going to move in my position. And I think since I've been in the role, I've actually been a little bit more bold in saying no and not really caring what the consequence was going to be. Just because I could say, I'm always tapped for this. I'm always going to be the one diversity on the search committee. So, I mean, at this point, I had done it for quite a while before I moved into the role. So once I kind of got into the assistant professor role, I kind of said, yeah, I don't think I can do this anymore and still try to fulfill my obligations in my role to reach tenure.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I was writing this paper as I was like interviewing. So I had like everything ready to go during my negotiations and things like that. And my head and my department, all of my colleagues are very well versed in this world and DEI, and they do a lot of that hard work and that research. And so I am very rarely tapped, but I've communicated a lot in that I don't want to be tapped and I will say no a lot, and I have said no a lot. But that doesn't mean that my voice isn't amplified and people aren't advocating for me when they want to. They just approach it in a way where I can share my piece and then they go on and take that work. And that's a lot. I'm very grateful for that, but I've done a lot of work in communicating that that's the kind of support that I need rather than I need to be in the room speaking all the time.
Thank you both. Reginald? And then we will probably have to cut it off, unfortunately, unless Ashley has us go longer.
Good. I was hoping that, I'd be sort of at the end so I can thank all the participants on behalf of NAGT. For those who don't know me, Reginald Archer, I'm the president of NAGT. And I just wanted to, again, echo some of the comments, both in the chat and that we heard today, for thanking those of you who provided your voices and supported JGE publications. And one of the things that, we heard throughout each of the presentations was that, and that we know in our just geosciences in general, that, we're the minority of the minorities, as Dr. Duncan just mentioned, but NAGT NAGT mirrors that in a sense, and we want to change that. So I encourage, most everyone here, if you can, to continue to support our diversity efforts led by the Diversity Committee, and participate, so we can continue to elevate the voices and change not only the way the organization looks, but change the landscape of the geosciences and STEM in general. I think all of our support is going to be needed to do that. So again, just wanted to thank the participants and mention that on behalf of NAGT. Back to you, Dana.
Thank you, Reginald. I put the basic NAGT link in there, but I'm happy to chat with anyone at another time if you're not as familiar with NAGT, but would like to become more familiar. I am going to pass it over to Ashley to let them do the conclusion for the webinar. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really wonderful. Are you able to see my screen? Great, thank you. So I'll go ahead and wrap up, and then if anyone's able to stay and has more questions, I can leave the room open. So thank you all for joining. An extra thank you, as Dr. Archer was saying, to our presenters. I really appreciate the work and your voices sharing with us today. The recording from today's webinar will be posted on the webinar page, and I'll send it out through the mailing list. Please do give me a couple of days though. I send it a way to be captioned so it's more accessible when it's posted. And then on my slide here, as you can see, this is our last webinar of the season. And keep an eye out. The next season starts in September 2024. And if you ever miss a webinar, you can check out the recording in the archive. I've also sent a link to the evaluation in the chat. And if you would like to receive a certificate of attendance, you can fill out the evaluation and it'll redirect you to that. Thank you again.